we know what this is about. We talked about this on Monday, but I just want to remind us that this is important work we're about to engage in. And I'm going to borrow from one of our esteemed colleagues the importance, and that is, many of you know I'm very inspired by the work of Antonio Darder. And in her article, Critical Leadership for Social Justice, she gives us about 20 items that represent ethical qualities of the political struggle for social justice. And of course, what I'm aiming for this morning is number 3, that we need to be rooted in a historical understanding of our collective existence. And so today we have assembled a panel for you that I think is going to broaden all of our understandings of our historical sense of this time and this place. So without further ado, let me introduce the first Vice President for Diversity, Inclusion, and Engagement at this university, and a gentleman who has retreat rights in the CCOE, Dr. Octavio Villapando, will moderate.
Thank you. Thank you, and I really appreciate you welcoming me and allowing me to be a part of this historic event here at Cal State LA. Cheryl said I'm the first vice president on the campus for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and hopefully I won't be the last because of the many changes that we're beginning to see happening across the institution, very positive changes. So it'll be incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we keep the momentum and continue to ensure greater access to our institution by our community and also the continuing success of our faculty and students. So I again want to thank Cheryl and the faculty, staff, and students of the Charter College of Education for hosting this historic event. In many ways, honoring the legacies of Mr. Sal Castro allow us to do our own reflection on how we as educators have also touched lives of students and communities in the work that we do and in the work that's ahead of us. He presents a challenge for many of us that will never live up to the kind of contributions and work that he instilled in our communities. And some would say that, many of those challenges continue to exist today, certainly in our public school systems, yet at the same time it's this kind of a push and pull that occurs in education historically, right? Well, on the one hand, it's very much of a contested terrain, and you have possibilities that are emerging, such as the creation of an ethnic studies requirement for high school graduates, right? That has now been delayed by a second year, and I know that Mr. Sal Castro is cheering that on wherever he may be, because it had been one of the issues that he believed was critical in the education of Chicanos, Mexican Americans, and Raza in general, as well as other communities. Here at Cal State LA, we're not falling too far behind. As some of you know, this year the president has announced the review and the establishment of a new college for ethnic studies here at Cal State LA. I agree. We're not the first, clearly, and it's shameful that it's taken 50 years following San Francisco State's lead to create such a college. But if anybody, any institution should have been the second, it should have been Cal State LA, and so better late than never. Look for more news on that as the year progresses. His intention is to have the college created by the beginning of next year. So those are my marching orders. Let me allow for as much conversation as possible with our illustrious panel. The order that they know which order they're going to come up in, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and describe their relationship vis-a-vis Sal Castro. We're going to ask that they limit their comments to 5 to 7 minutes, so that there's some time for general questions as well from you, and comments and conversation, which is what we're striving for here. And I want to remind you that this panel is being videotaped, so we should all be in our best behavior because those tapes last a long time. So with that, let me invite our first speaker who happened to have known him very well, and that is Ms. Charlotte Lerchemiller.
Okay, we can start the PowerPoint, please. Good morning. I'm Charlotte Lerchemiller. For 45 years, Sal Castro was a constant in my life and I in his. He said that we were lifelong partners and that I was his best friend. We were married. I'm going to talk to the Sal Castro as a teacher. My panel mates, I'm sure, will address the political, historical, activist aspects of Sal and the walkouts. Sal Castro should never have been successful, as there were many markers that could have indicated non-achievement. You notice I did not say failure. His parents were immigrants from Mexico. Mother Carmen was from Nogales, Sonora, a presser, and father Salvador from Mazatlan, Sinaloa, and a baker. Both had papers. They met here and were married. Sal was born on October 25th, 1933, in East Los Angeles. In 1936, his father was deported as the U.S. government went through a repatriation program because the Mexicans, as you know, were the reason for the Depression. Yeah. For 3 years or so, Sal and his mother traveled back and forth between Los Angeles and Mazatlan. Family separation, marker 1. Ultimately, his parents divorced, so he was now being raised by a single mother, marker 2. His first schooling was in Mazatlan, and his first language was Spanish, marker 3. When he entered school in East Los Angeles, he and his mother were living in an extended family situation on 6th Street behind Stevenson Junior High. And he was an ESL student, although there was no organized program, marker 4. He attended Rowan and Belvedere elementary schools. His mother met and married Antonio Zapata when Sal was 12, and now Sal had a stepfather, marker 5. They lived in the Pico Union area, and Sal worked in his stepfather's shoe repair shop while a student at St. Thomas, marker 6. He passed the exam to get into Loyola High, but the cost was too expensive, so high school was at Cathedral. Right after graduating from Cathedral, Sal was drafted into the Army, as this was the Korean conflict, marker 7. When he got out of the Army in 1955, he and his first wife were married, marker 8. He immediately entered LA City College as a veteran, marker 9. His first son was born in 1956. He was going to school, married, and working, marker 10. Some of the jobs: busboy, Sheraton Townhouse, selling women's shoes in downtown Bullock's basement, making deliveries for Bullock's Wilshire, playground director for LA Parks and Recreation at Toberman and Echo Park Playgrounds, youth services director at Solano Avenue and 10th Street Schools. A second son was born in 1959. He graduated from LA City College and walked across the street to start LA State, where he earned his degree and teaching credential, the first in his family. He was a Diablo. He student taught at San Marino High. He and his first wife divorced, and he began his teaching career in fall 1962 at Washington Junior High for the Pasadena School District. He was a divorced father now, marker 11. In fall 1963, he started teaching at Belmont High, where he worked in the attendance office and taught U.S. history, U.S. government. He noticed that although Mexican American students were the majority population, there were no Mexican American students as student body officers or on the student council. He organized a group of students to run in the election, calling themselves the Tortilla Party. And they spoke Spanish in their campaign speeches on stage. They won, and because Sal Castro had them speak Spanish, a mortal sin, he was summarily transferred to Lincoln High, marker 12. He was on punishment. He had 6 different preps and was a traveling teacher, 6 different classrooms. Remember, he had a general secondary credential. He taught typing, math, history, government. Eventually, he was recognized for his abilities and worked in the attendance office, was the athletic director, and the sponsor of the Honor Society, the Knights, along with teaching United States history and United States government. In addition to his teaching and playground jobs, Sal's community involvement was as a field rep for George Brown, David Roberti, George Danielson. He served on the Democratic Central Committee, helped found the Association of Mexican American Educators, was a facilitator at the Mexican American Youth Leadership Conference, and worked with MAPA, the Mexican American Political Association. Let's look at what education and the educational system was like for Mexican Americans. The Mexican schools, and that's what they were called, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Garfield, Wilson, Belmont, had a 50% plus dropout rate. The school facilities were in poor repair. Classrooms were overcrowded. There were few Mexican American teachers. There was one Mexican American principal in the entire Los Angeles school district for high school, and he was in the Valley. Very few counselors, no college counselors. Tracking of students, vocational ed for the boys, business and cosmetology for the girls. Low college recruitment, high military recruitment. No Spanish was allowed. Corporal punishment. No culturally relevant activities. Low, low, low expectations. Here's what a Lincoln High School teacher had to say. Most of the Mexican Americans have never had it so good. Before the Spanish came, he was an Indian grubbing in the soil. And after the Spanish came, he was a slave. It seems to me that America must be a very desirable place. Witness the number of wetbacks and migrants, both legal and illegal, from Mexico. When it comes to school, free and the best in the world, he, the Mexican American, is passive. Absenteeism is his culture, his way of life. Always mañana. Maybe he will get an education. Mañana, when it comes to repairing his home, controlling childbirth, planning for tomorrow. He is passive. This was said by Richard Davis, a woodshop teacher at Lincoln High School. Sal believed educational justice was the fundamental right to a quality education for Chicano, Chicana, Latino, Latina youth. So there were the 1968 blowouts, AKA the walkouts. March 6th through 8th, 20,000 students stood up for educational reform. Sal Castro was their teacher. On May 31st, Sal and 12 others were arrested. They were known as the East LA 13, marker 14. They were arrested on 15 counts of disturbing the peace of the schools and 15 counts of conspiracy to disturb the peace of the schools. The conspiracy charge made it a felony. more than 60 years of jail time if convicted. He was removed from his teaching position. There were demonstrations and a sit-in at the Board of Education for Sal to be returned to Lincoln. In October 1968, he was returned to his teaching job. Marker 15. Then the school district, along with the LA County District Attorney, went after him. Marker 16. He went on a leave and worked for KNBC on a Chicano history series. He returned to teaching in 1971 and was placed at North Hollywood High. In the meantime, Max Rafferty, superintendent of California schools, went after his teaching credential. It didn't work. Marker 17. In 1972, all of the charges against Sal and the East LA 13 were dismissed by the California State Appellate Court based on the constitutional right of redress against the government and freedom of speech. The case was known as Salvatore Castro et al. The school district then provided Sal with freeway therapy, moving him from North Hollywood High to Eagle Rock High to Gardena High to day-to-day status until fall of 1973, when he was returned to Belmont High School, where he had started his career in 1963. Marker 18. Now he was a teacher in a 4,000 student year-round school, and he remained there until he retired in 2003. He had a target on his back, as administrators were always trying to earn their stripes. Alleged colleagues wouldn't sign. Can you guys hear my phone ringing? Okay, good, because only in my hearing aids can I hear it. Good. I'm not going to answer it. Alleged colleagues wouldn't sign slips for students going on college trips, as it was Castro who was organizing the trip, and they would tell the kids to their faces that they were not college material. He taught U.S. government, U.S. history, contemporary American problems. He took students on field trips to colleges and universities throughout Southern California. He had outside speakers come into his classroom, a visual, alive, and exciting place. He was culturally relevant and responsive in his teaching. He gave speeches up and down the state of California. He served on the LAUSD Interscholastic Athletic Commission. He was on the Hollywood Free Clinic Board of Directors. He was a member of the LA County Interagency Against Child Abuse and Neglect. He was a commissioner on the LA County's Parks and Recreation Commission. He was a good union man. He supervised football games and timed track meets. He organized Cinco de Mayo celebrations. He started a rondilla. He organized and presented the Chicano Student Scholarship Night at Dodger Stadium. He was a long-term absence counselor. He worked on the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference. This was his baby. He coached his sons in their flag football, baseball, and basketball teams. He did the same coaching for his grandsons. I think we could say he kept busy. Now there is a school named for him, a book about him, many articles about him, several documentaries about him, an LAUSD award named for him, a conference at UCSB named for him, and now the Distinguished Educator Award from Cal State. From pariah to hero in only 50 years. That's Sal Castro, the teacher. Not bad for somebody with 18 markers. Now we'd like to do a sound bite about Sal and how he considered himself. I interviewed him for StoryCorps when it was in East Los Angeles in March 2010. You're going to hear my voice on it.
In your
also.
private, personal life, you're a father and a grandfather. In your professional, public life, you've been called a teacher, an educator, an activist, an educational reformer, a civil rights leader. What do you call yourself?
A concerned American that wants this country to really live up to its promise of equality, equal justice under the law, liberty and justice for all, promoting the general welfare of all its citizenry, and just one of the folks that's trying to make this the country that of all its promises.
What's your greatest pleasure from your 42-year teaching career?
Seeing kids come back and say, yeah, I listened to you, Castro. I went to school. I'm a teacher. Just yesterday, I ran across a young person that's a math teacher at Adams. There's about 8 teachers at Logan Avenue. And just about everywhere I go, kids come back and say hello. It's always Mr. Castro. And that's exciting.
How do you want to be remembered?
As a teacher of young people that tried to make life better for them.
That's my poopsie. Now, how about an honorary doctorate?
All right, okay, this is working. So we were asked to reflect, and one of the things I want to think through is the relevance of the legacy, but I also want to concretize it, bring it back to my own work here as a new faculty member, but also not new in many ways, and I'll kind of speak through that. I think that what happens is in a lot of organizing and activism, we tend to focus on individuals and the efforts they've done. And I think those actions are important and commendable. But also, I want to argue that these are all community efforts, and they're also in a very deep way historical and spiritual. But I think context in history matters. I'm a student of social movements and have studied them, created and reflected on critical literacy work and also action research and popular education and what that means. I spoke a little bit about this. It was about 10, 12 years doing grassroots organizing in South LA, joining organizations, helping form them as well. I was knee deep in that work. And one of the things that I think is significant, and there should be a slide up, if you can, yeah, is the history and the context that matters. And the educational neglect of Chicano students in the U.S. Southwest is pretty deplorable. So the United Way, what you see here are statistics, right, on the context of 1968. And what you see there, to me, when I read it, it's just sad because it's a continuous set of inequities that are still pervasive today. You know, students graduating at an 8th grade reading level. That was myself, graduating from Bell High School. The 40 class size, I mean, I know supposedly the law is at 20-1, then it went to 24-1, but you walk into urban contexts and spaces, LAUSD, and even what are called suburbs. Once you see brown and black kids in those contexts, you also see the numbers go up. The push-out rate. I don't use dropout, but the push-out rate is at 57.5. I know a lot of districts tend to underrepresent that, especially in the context of standardized testing now. You know, some of the districts in Orange County, because I come from some of the organizing there, they say they have like a 3% push-out, and that's just, it's not the reality. They're playing with numbers. 1 to 4,000, so for every 4,000 students, basically in a high school, there's one guidance counselor. If you recall the 2008 protests that were happening around LAUSD that peered onto 2010, it was students in the community fighting against these very same conditions. In an interview in 2010, Gila Ochoa interviewed Sal Castro, and he said, Nothing's really changed, even though we've got more brown faces. A hell of a lot more brown faces in positions that should do some good. So when I think about the historical context, the 1968 walkouts were more than about access to higher ed. They often get framed as such. And I think I want to qualify what I say. For me, education is central, it's important, it's a goal. But it's not the only one. Because often I think movements get narrowed down into they're just protesting and fighting for these things. I think we need to think beyond the walkouts as a discrete event. And it's not the space to unpack it, but there was and still is an enduring Chicano and also intergenerational and intersectional movement that's emerged. I think that a bigger context is something I reflected on, and I'm a student of ethnic studies, I'm a student of Chicano studies, I'm a student of my own history at a later age in my life, but it's something that I've been providing to my kids. Amarilis, who I was talking about, who's now 10, who's trying to make sense of what deculturalization means for a young Chicana that's empowered, but at the same time enters schools that's deculturalizing her, a place that doesn't respond to her needs. And so one of the things, my daughter had a California history project, and we had to subvert that. Chicanos are not Spanish. Chicanos are not the missionaries. That's the narrative that was getting perpetuated in the curriculum. But also when you look at the history prior to 1848 in the U.S. Southwest, in California specifically, there's this vast sort of erasure of what this was, or what Chicano, Mexicano people were. We're also not white supremacists. I know there's a discourse and a framing that's happening, even amongst Native scholars, I must say, and I won't name who they are. So for me, I think there's just been at least a 500-year history of what has been termed becoming ontological foreigners. Our very being is one of erasure, but it's also one of resistance. And so I think the legacy of Sal Castro is about community self-determination, and I really want us to think beyond making struggles about individuals. The youth movements that were emerging at that time were both spontaneous in the sense that there were sets of historical contradictions where people had enough, ya basta, as people would say. I kind of use a metaphor of a rubber band. You stretch it, and there's a point where it's not going to go anymore. And there are blowouts. And so the metaphor, I think, is appropriate. But also, I think in those movements, there was something generative. And so that's what I mean by seeing these struggles as more than discrete events. We want to think of the role of women, mujeres, mothers, also the role of familias in those instantiations of organizers and community elders. I also think of the unspoken stories of the Mexicanos, like my mother, who was here during that context, working in as an exploited Mexican immigrant in a garment shop. And she has a very distinct vantage point on all the things that were happening. Where are their stories and their contributions as well as part of that mass labor pool that exists today that's sustaining a lot of what we do. We open our refrigerators and that magically doesn't appear. It's one of the things that students know very well, and if they haven't forgotten, then we go into lessons about where does this food come from and who picks it and who works it. I'm gonna leave with this thought, because I only have 5 minutes and I'm probably extending beyond it. I think some of the lessons of the legacy of Sal Castro is this notion of prefiguring what it means to be a, quote, community educator, not just a teacher, but a community educator. In our discussions organizing, we've invited teachers from Oaxaca, Mexico. They would always tell us we need to think beyond the four walls of a classroom. The maestro, maestra is also an aunt and an uncle, and is a brother and a sister, and literally in biological terms, but also metaphorically and relationally and spiritually and ethically. The other is that I think the other point is about prefiguration. I think in a lot of movements, in my experience, there's this kind of tendency to think of like the ends justify the means. When I look at the legacy of Sal Castro and also hear the voice, I'm personally really attuned to the humility in the way somebody has taken up that work and that conviction. There isn't a self-aggrandizement. We're all in process, but how through being in process and struggling together, we're also prefiguring a better world, not for tomorrow, but in the present. And if you're interested, Ana Celia Dinerstein's done some amazing work around prefiguration. It's coming from a lot of feminist politics that I think is very powerful. So in the context of you learn and thinking about what Sal Castro's legacy and how it informs the College of Ed, for me, it's about re-envisioning the urban learning program. That's why I was brought in, and that's why I'm here. And so the kinds of questions that I ask myself is, in what ways do we center community needs, aspirations, and dreams when we think of preparing urban educators? How do we seed and nurture community consciousness in our teachers? How do we model that as faculty members and educators for our students? Because it would be a big contradiction. We're writing social justice community work, and we're not doing it. And the other is, how do we imagine what is possible beyond institutional mandates? I think institutional mandates are important, but they need not be the goal. They often are misleading communities. They have historically. We really want to go deep into the analysis of the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing onto like everything, even like with the universities asking students to complete. So if you can go to the last slide. In March 2012, there was a Save Adult Ed campaign that was an offshoot of the 2008 crisis that was happening nationwide, but was manifest. Remember all the teachers getting fired, over 8,000 in the state of California, and class sizes just skyrocketed, and supposedly there was no money, but at the same time, like, how did they bail out the banks? I like to look at bigger data, and I talk about to the students. Students are always like, how did that happen? 4.3 trillion to bail out the banks under Obama. In the end, we couldn't have, like even 5% of that amount to like save schools. But this was a photo of the Save Adult Ed campaign, and Sal Castro was integral to the organizing, and I was moved. I was asked as part of a grassroots organization to document some of that, and in my archives, I got to look back, and we also have some interviews and stuff that I'd like to, provide to the College of Ed as a resource for education. But I think that we need to take that legacy and that commitment to activism that I imagine was enduring to the very end. And it's an ethic, it's a way of being. And so the questions that I ask are, what are the resources that sustain us as people committed to this work? What are the cultural, community, and I love to bring this into the context of schools, education, the work I do. What are also the spiritual resources? And by those, I don't mean institutionalized religion, but the spiritual resources of community and solidarity that are also a part of what we do and that give us fuel in the everyday fight that we're engaged in. So those are beyond my 5 minutes, but that's what I have. Thank you.
So we were told we have 5 to 7 minutes. I'm setting my timer, so I don't.
I took all the time.
No, well, except for Charlotte, who was able to set the context of really who Sal is. So I'm, let me make sure I get this in there. I'm Dolores Delgado Bernal. I know many of you because even though I'm the, can you hear me? Yeah. Even though I'm the chair of Chicano Latino Studies, I'm affiliated with CCOE, and when I'm no longer chair, I will have my joint appointment back with CCOE. I think I was asked to be on this panel because for my dissertation, I actually focused on the 68 blowouts, specifically the women. But a part of that, you cannot focus on the 68 blowouts without focusing on Sal also. And so Sal, I was never a student of Sal's, but I interviewed him and had a number of interactions with him. This was around in 1995, 1996. It's the one that says Sal Castro CCOE. And so as part of my dissertation, I interviewed 8 women. Thank you. I interviewed these 8 women. So these are women who, as high school and college students, were active in the blowouts. There were many more women, but you're right, I wanted to finish and have a dissertation, so I focused on these 8. The ones who went to Lincoln were very, very directly impacted by Sal, but all of them, even students that went to the other high schools or were in college, commented and talked about his influence as a mentor, as a role model, as a teacher, as an activist. All of them commented about that. And one of the things, folks, that I think we were asked to organize our thoughts is one of the questions was, what might Sal say to all of us as educators preparing teachers? And I thought, well, before I offer that, let me say some of the things that his students said about him. So I want to give you a couple things of that. I also want to show you, that was the 8 women. These were 5 of the women who were here at Cal State LA just about a year and a half ago when they had the 50th anniversary. I think it's important that many of those folks he've influenced, and it came out in the interview that Charlotte did, became educators themselves. So 6 of the 8 women that I interviewed are now retired educators. One of them a nurse and archivista, who I would argue is also an educator, and somebody who worked in the schools in the food service in East LA schools. schools. And so all of them point to how there was a spark with Sal that moved him into the field of education and into being an educator. Sal taught a class during that mini list of how he got moved around, right? At one point when he was at Lincoln, he taught a class that was like an advising classroom where he was supposed to work with students and help them kind of figure out what to do. And they had a curriculum that he was supposed to follow. Celeste Baca, several of the students had him for this class, but Celeste Baca, when she talks, was actually like a student assistant. She calls it a secretary. She was his secretary, but she was a student assistant during that period. And so she talks about how he broke down the curriculum for the students. And this is what she says. I was working as his secretary at the time. I would listen to him in the class, and in that guidance class was where we would talk to his students about, lack of quality education and so on and so forth. A guidance class was basically where you started to plan your future. And they would give you these little tests to see what you seemed to be, what your preference was. Was it clerical? Was it business? Was it going into science or whatever? And then after the test, he'd say, see, this is a bunch of bullshit. They're trying to track you into these different things. So, I was listening to him also, and he was a very dynamic person. And as a teacher, he was fantastic. 2 other women talked about how he would say, this is bullshit. And I think that's one of the things Sal would still say today is a lot of what's happening to our youth of color, working class students in schools is bullshit. And so part of that, I think, is what spurred his activism, his being an educator. I think one of the things that he would say to all of us is, and Charlotte mentioned it, and back then this wasn't the language that was used, but that Sal was culturally relevant as a teacher. And I think today, so using, Gloria Latson-Billings, our colleague, I think he would use that today to tell all of us to be culturally relevant educators so that we can nurture our students to be culturally relevant educators. And just as a reminder, what does that mean, right? In Gloria Latson-Billings' words, well, an emphasis on student learning and achievement, something we all know and it's important, right? Affirmation of students' cultural competence. That's something that Sal fought for. It was one of the demands during the 68 blowouts that students fought for and something that he consistently included, and why students came back and said, I listened to you, because he realized how important it was for them to be culturally competent, to affirm who they were. But I think most importantly for all of us in working with educators and future teachers is this third component that Latson-Billings says is part of being culturally competent, and that is facilitation of a socio-political critical consciousness that facilitates students' understanding and critique of inequities within educational and social institutions. And I think today a lot of people forget when they talk about cultural competency, too often it goes back to, the food, fun, and fiestas. And that's not what it is. That third one is what Sal did. That third one is what Latson-Billings says is key. And it's something that we have to work at if we're going to have our students understand and break down inequalities and build their consciousness as teachers. Only through that can they then begin to do that with our students. So that exactly what happened in the 68 walkouts is he was helping students. My timer just went off for 6 minutes. He was helping students understand and critique the inequities, and that's why they were able to get the momentum. And I would argue, though things didn't completely change, I would argue there was a lot of success in what they did because of him being able to do this cultural competency. Thank you.
I'm Fernando Hernandez, Professor Emeritus at Cal State. Former chair, and I'm glad the urban learning program's still around. Myself and a lot of us in AASC helped to found that program. So I'm very happy to be here. I want to give you a different kind of perspective, and the perspective I want to give you is 1967 on the ground. I was there, along with David Sandoval. I was a young student at Cal State Long Beach. I helped found the United Mexican American Students. And I first got to know Sal Castro indirectly because Sal Castro used to do a youth leadership program at Camp Hess Kramer every year. And I couldn't go, but my two sisters got invited to Camp Hess Kramer. We were in a program called Team Post, and I was a young assistant director there. And there was this foment there. There was this dissatisfaction among Latino students, among Mexican students. And we felt something, but we didn't know what it was. And so my sisters went to Camp Hess Kramer. And when they came back, we had this big discussion. And it was a trippy discussion. You know what the discussion was about? It was about what does it mean to be white? It was a discussion about at school, and this comes out of this contact with Sal Castro, at school, the teachers wanted us to become white because becoming white meant to become successful. You could not be white and Mexican at the same time. You had to choose between being white and successful or being Mexican and working class. And so then we had this big discussion around the family, and we got all excited, and my sister said, we got to do something. And so I asked my sister Raquel this morning when I called her, I said, what do you remember most about Camp Hess Kramer? She said, it was my baptism in becoming a change agent. It was my baptism in becoming a change agent. Because when I got out of Camp Hess Kramer, she said, I wanted to change the world. She said, and not only did I want to change it, I knew I could. And that's the difference. And that's what Sal Castro inspired in us. So when we, and David was part of that because we were all part of that same UMAS network, when we got the call from Sal, and Sal got us all together, all the college students, and he said, I want your heads. And everybody thought, oh, how cool. He sees us as an intellect. He said, no, I want you guys to get beat up before the students get beat up. and that's what he meant. And so we got in there, and our job was to protect the students. We would meet almost weekly, sometimes at his house. Sometimes we would come together at one of the universities, either here, Cal State LA, or at Cal State Long Beach, and we would strategize, and we were being tailed around by the police, and we were constantly being harassed. But there was something inside of us that said, this has to change. Ya basta. Ya no podemos más. And we began to form this identity that said, you could be a Mexican and you could be successful. You don't have to be white in order to be successful. Now, that didn't mean that you hate white people. That meant you could be yourself and be successful. That's the lesson. So then, what I learned from that, and I think what all of us learned from that, is that there's this phase that every student of color has to go through. And it's this phase where you must, at some point in time, come to grips with your identity and say, this is who I am. This is where I come from. And Sal was a historian, and he said, now, he said, if you could write history from your point of view, what would that history be like? It wouldn't be like the history you're being taught at Banning High School, where I came from. It'd be a different kind of history because your perspective has never been represented there. And the only way that we can get that way, that we can get there, is through change. So we were all baptized as change agents. And that's where that's where it started. And so at some point in time in my life, I got to Cal State LA, and I knew what I had to do. And so when Phil Viral became the dean, I went to go see Phil Viral, and I said, there's a group of us that want you to start working on bilingual education, on bilingual bicultural education. When we had an opportunity to do urban learning, I said to Alan Morey, and I was chair, I want that program, and I want it in our division, because we need an interdisciplinary approach. It was about change. That's what Sal Castro was. If there's one thing that I remember about Sal was, you go out there and you do it, but you don't do it like it's been done. You change it, and you change it so it works for everybody. Because the real lesson in Sal Castro's life, and the one thing that he and I used to talk about all the time, you know what? If it works for Mexicans, it'll probably work for all students. Thank you.
Good morning. That's not gonna work. Good morning. I will apologize ahead of time if I stumble over words or my emotions trip me up. I'm going to speak with a bit of a heavy heart right now. I usually write things out because it just helps you, and then I read it, and then I just speak from the heart. But like I said, I'm speaking with a bit of a heavy heart right now. So I'm going to read. I want to begin by sharing that I never had the honor of working with Sal Castro, or of simply shaking his hands or sharing words. I never saw him in person or heard him speak in public. But I am certain that our paths have crossed and that our lives are inextricably tied, like the roots of a tree to soil, or the survival of our species to the well-being of the earth. Hence, I have no special insights on Sal Castro or his work. But in the spirit of the indigenous storytelling and story work I have studied throughout this summer, I will share a segment of a centuries-long story that highlights how our paths have crossed and our lives relate. A story that honors the legacy of Sal Castro's work and speaks to its potential for shaping the future of our college. This segment of the story begins with the understanding that we are not only descendants of people, we are also descendants of ideologies and practices. From this understanding, the segment of the story I want to share moves to 1965, when I was born to Mexican immigrants who were exiled to Los Angeles by the poverty and inequality created by Western imperialism and the brutality of its colonialism throughout the Western Hemisphere, the same one currently sending us its refugees from Central America. It was a Los Angeles whose social fabric was the product of a long genealogy of ideologies and practices that did everything to reduce Mexican immigrants and their descendants to laboring and subservient nobodies who would be afraid to occupy the very space of their existence, who would be content with second-class citizenry and an inferiorized sense of self. I was born into a hostile and unwelcoming Los Angeles only 3 years before Sal Castro, Paula Cristostomo, Mita Curon, Vicky Castro, and thousands of other students walked out of Los Angeles' hostile and unwelcoming high schools in 1968. And only 2 years after they walked out, I was walked into public schooling in Los Angeles, accompanied by my parents' hopes and dreams. And after only 2 years of schooling, by second grade, I had learned to fear the very space of my existence in the classroom. I had learned to be a Spanish-speaking little boy who wanted to disappear and be a nobody because a nobody could avoid being singled out as an unintelligent boy who couldn't read and didn't speak correctly. The darkness of my beautiful skin and the loudness of my accent had been woven into the lessons of a hidden curriculum that had taught me to seek safety in the silence and anonymity of the classroom. I could have easily disappeared somewhere along the public and parochial schooling of my childhood and adolescence. But somehow I survived their schooling. The burden of not crushing my parents' hopes and dreams, always outweighing whatever schooling threw at me. And when I walked out of high school with a diploma in 1983, there was a path that had been cleared for me by all those who, like Sal Castro, had walked out in protest in 1968. Their movement against the schooling for subservience and the educational exclusion they received in schooling spotlighted genealogies of ideologies and practices directly tied to both social domination and the possibility of social struggle against that domination. I walked onto the campus of the University of California at Santa Cruz in 1983 because Sal Castro and thousands of others walked out of their high schools in 1968. My arrival at opportunity was enabled by their departure against domination. The risk-filled road they walked opened the path of possibility I found ahead of me. Without ever meeting, we crossed paths, and our lives are inextricably tied. A different unfolding of this story was made possible by their struggle. Today, as a tenured professor and pedagogue who once feared the spaces of his existence in the classrooms of his childhood and adolescence, I am a living embodiment of the social debt that is owed to Sal Castro and the thousands of other students of 1968, of the need to commemorate and commit to the fragile lineage of educational opportunity, equity, and access they helped engender with the conception and labor of their struggle. A fragile lineage that is under assault even as we honor Sal Castro here at Cal State LA. A lineage that is under assault on this very campus on which we commemorate Sal Castro's legacy today. The type of story that was made possible by Sal Castro and thousands of others in 1968 is being erased by social mobility speaking neoliberals in suits and access denying declarations of impaction. It is precisely here, in the face of this assault, that the type of story I am sharing can be salvaged, that the legacy of Sal Castro and his struggle can inform the future of our college. Sal Castro taught us to fight back in the classroom and the streets outside of it when necessary. He taught us to not simply accept what is and to struggle for what should be. That is his legacy, to struggle and fight back. And it might need to be the story of the future of our college if we are to fulfill our purported mission and serve our students. What could be more honoring of his legacy than extending it in the curricular content of our courses, in the structuring of equity and access into our syllabi and our assessments, in our pedagogical engagement of our students, and in our resistance to the forces from afar that impose neoliberal lies and logics about more effective and efficient teacher education. I will bookmark this story, honoring Sal Castro and his legacy, in the spirit of the indigenous storytelling and story work I studied throughout this summer, by paraphrasing one of the indigenous storytellers and scholars who gifted me with their words this summer. You can take this story. It's now yours, or not. Do with it what you will. Share it with your colleagues and your students. Tell it to your family and friends. Turn it into a movie or a television series, if you will. Forget it or ignore it. But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life or practiced your profession differently if only you had heard this story. You've heard it now. Thank you.
Let me start my timer. I have a tendency to go on and on and on. It's technology, man. I don't even know how to answer the phone sometimes.
Ignore my calls.
My name's David Sandoval. I've been on campus for, some people say, too many years. Oh, yeah. Ooh. Yeah, they thought I was here when the Spaniards came here and grew the trees, the rose bushes that were here. I didn't say that. Teixeira said that about me. And I don't go back as far as the guy thinks, to 67. he was on the upper echelon. I never knew that the reason they called us to go to these schools was to get beat up. But since I was big for my age, I was a 21-year-old freshman here, transferred from East LA. Went to East LA for too long. But I think the legacy that Sal leaves for all of us is the thing that he didn't compromise. And he wasn't doing it for himself. You mentioned honorary doctorate, and I think in this world it's doable. In this place it's doable. I've seen people on campus get the same thing. And this man has given a lot more than many of the people who receive some of these. And not to put them down, it's just important. The other thing I think that he left me with, because I didn't know him that well, but as I started going through my archives, which people call archives, Soldatenko, I left a bunch of junk in an office because he made me come back and teach a class. He took all that junk, I never came back for it. I woke up one night and I was checking the internet on Cal State LA Library, and it says David Sandoval Archives. I said, must be the artist from Denver. You know, it can't be me or the health guru, you know. So I called him up. He said, yeah, pendejo, we did an archive for you. You know, all that shit that you left in the office, we gave it to an archivist, and they looked through it and took the best stuff. Problem is, a lot of stuff I threw away. In the last few weeks, with your encouragement, and it's the 50th anniversary of EOP, so I'm a pioneer in that too, I find out, because of age. I went to my archives, personal archive, which is at a warehouse downtown. A friend of mine owns the whole square block. He just sold it, so I had to take all the stuff out. My wife said, don't bring it home because it's a bunch of junk. I don't want it here. I started going through DVDs and a lot of stuff that I had, and it turns out I just got a house load of stuff that to me is not junk, and to probably you it won't be junk. But then I came across a lot of tapes of Sal, not only in the walkout type stuff, but when Ken Burns didn't include Latinos in the Army series, he was out there protesting with us at KCET. And, you know, I lost track of who I tape after a while, or who I film, or you know, the crews that I've kind of mentored over the years. So there's a lot of stuff still to be looked at. I mean, I was trying to be as organized as you on your stuff, but technology's changed on me. I've gone from film to digital, which I'm totally lost. So now when I do a project, I hire a crew that knows what they're doing. Anyway, I think the importance that Sal left in our classroom that day that he came to speak, which was, what, 5, 6 years ago now? Maybe longer? No, it's got to be 10 years.
Much longer.
It was 10 years ago.
Dead six.
At least 10 or 15. Oh, damn, I've been gone that long. Is that a student came in and said, you know, this guy wants to speak in your class. And I said, no, we can't. It's structured, you know, and you only have so much time. She says, okay. So then she comes back again. Well, he's my neighbor, and he says he'd really like to speak in your class. I said, okay, I'll give him 45 minutes. So, because, you know, you're structured. I'm not used to structure, being in the administrative side, and all of a sudden being teaching a class. I go, oh, man. Finally, I said, okay, you know, he says he needs more than 45 minutes. He needs a whole class. I said, well, who is it? He said, Sal Castro. I said, why didn't you say that to begin with? So he came in. I guess he was a neighbor to a young lady and stuff like that. And he came in, and he was just great. He was great with the students. One of the things that he left us with, though, and there's photographs. I think you'll use some of the photographs from the class. And I have photographs with him because of some of the anniversaries. We took pictures. Because all the people that were spawned from that movement that you spoke of and that you spoke of were all students of ours, either here at Cal State or other places, you know. But who was to know back when we met them how they were going to end up in the social movement? The one thing that Sal did say is he really didn't want anything from himself, recognition, but the thing that always sticks in my mind, and it seemed like a simple thing to be able to get, to this day, he says, I want a simple plaque at Park recognizing the students who were there. He didn't say, I want a plaque for me, all right, I want something for me. He just wanted something to recognize all the students. Anyway, there's so much more I could say to tail on a little bit on what you were saying. He inspired not only local movements, but if you study better than I can study, social science and political movements around the world, at the same time, before internet, before communication and WhatsApp and Google and all this stuff, people were doing the same thing because social and political conditions in certain areas in this country and in the world were happening at the same time. So this phenomenon, when you look at it, it's in Jose Angel Gutierrez's latest book. He mentions, he dedicates the book to Sal Castro, who started it all, not only here, but at the same time, those social movements were happening in China, in Africa, in Paris, in all over the world. And once these people started getting together, imagine what a force we could be. Not an ethnic force, but a class force of people who are experiencing the same thing. And I think that's the thing that we have to look at. To be an activist, you got to challenge the status quo. And sometimes, unfortunately, we got to challenge our own status quo. And sometimes have to pay the price. So I challenge you to read and do many of those things, because it's not only a question of being an activist. These people had to go back and study and learn what was the right thing. There were a lot of mentors that we had besides Sal Castro on this campus, that came from this campus. Thank you, and anything I got books to give away. I don't have them all here. There's a case, a friend of mine that owns the square block sold the building, but he's got hundreds of these books that we're trying to get away, but people say, bilingual education, what's that, you know?
It's called dual language
Exactly,
now.
exactly. So
It's got a new
this
name,
is supposedly
dual
a
language.
primary book, and I've got 2 cases of those, and then there's another motivation, which I thought I was too much of a revolutionary, so in the beginning when I met this man, I thought, oh man, he's just a politician, Roy Baum. So I dedicated the rest of my super left-wing activist life to try and get a book out, and a friend of mine ended up publishing this. So there are a lot of people there that we could take advantage of because they were there. Vahak Martirosyan, Armenian, grew up in Tijuana. You know, there's a whole book about him. He became an activist, inspired by the walkouts, inspired by Sal, and people want to know, what the hell is this Armenian doing that becomes a Mexican? You know, he's got an interesting book. Thank you.
So it's really hard to go last for a number of reasons. Like Carlos mentioned, I'm gonna jumble through this. I didn't even write anything down, so that's gonna be hard for me for many different reasons. First and foremost, I mean, the question that out of the 2 that were put out there for us is, what do you take to heart from Sal? And I think from Sal you take his heart, and that's what you sort of put out there. This is someone who I think his mantra was one of love, if that makes sense. I think in one of the Ochoa interview, one of the questions he was asked is, what would you say to today's teachers? And is you start with the love for the kids, not for your subject matter. You start loving the kids and you know you're gonna go to the wall for them. And if you're gonna go to the wall for them, you better wreak ethnic studies. So I'm glad that this announcement of the college coming to campus, it's one that I think it's beyond necessary. Even when I first showed up to the CCOE, I was looking around, I'm saying, I work for a college of education, I'm trying to count the brown faces. I kid you not, it was hard. But with that said, I feel like I got, from the 3 times I met Sal in person, I got sort of my crash course in ethnic studies. And I think the dean talks a lot about linked learning. I feel like this was my kinesthetic learning, like it was the applied learning. Like I took classes in college, but I went to an R1 school where honestly we didn't have the true human movement there. I think when I met Sal, to me that was it right there. I came back from college, I volunteered to CYLC as one of the folks. This is what you did. You showed up. You knew who Sal was if you grew up in the neighborhood. I went to Roosevelt High School. I went to Belvedere Middle School. I went to Roosevelt High School when it had 5,400 students, 3 tracks. I went to college with as many students in an undergraduate four-year program, so it was what it was. And you never questioned it until you got a chance to have a conversation about why it was, as Dolores put it, bullshit, right? And so when I met Sal, Sal never was never over assuming. He would ask you a lot of questions. He talked to you. He humanized you. He made you feel like you mattered. And I think Fernando was talking about a baptism. I definitely felt a little splash of water. So we showed up to the camp, and the thing is, you're there for kids. I had just finished college. The last thing I did before leaving is I was working for the TRIO programs, and I taught a class in ethnic studies for them. And so we talked Sal Castro, and then I'm like, cool, I get to go to the camp now. It was more like, I'm excited. The students are like, I don't know what's up with you. And I'm like, I'm gonna go do something fun, and I'm moving back to LA. And when we started having a conversation, he asked me, like, where are you from, the schools you went to. It was almost as though we were talking sports, right? Like, you went here, then here, and here. And when I told him I had finished off at Stanford, he's like, that's great. He's like, that's great for you. He's like, but what's great for all of us, right? And I think it brought to light that nothing had really changed over time. Like, we had had people in certain positions, and there's sort of like stars out there, but at the end of the day, it's about the entire community, and it was about what we all stood for as individuals. So what I took away immediately was egalitarianism. This is about all of us. This is about how we build community and how we look out for each other. There was this universe of obligation that I think Sal pushed and bestowed on people. There was also this aspect of self-determination that I truly took to heart. Like, if you're going to work in education, you got to own it. And he basically put you to work. And initially here, as you're at camp, I had never gone to camp. A lot of us kids from the hood had never gone to camp. We didn't know what that was. So you're supposed to lead chants. You're supposed to sing songs. You're supposed to run around. You're supposed to wear matching shirts. All that did not. It was not part of my vocabulary, even though I had just come from a space where there was a lot of that going on, and there was a lot of sort of institutionalization of people. But what I saw is something that Carlos had told me once is the reason we do our work is to open people's eyes. And part of that is what Dolores was describing as that sociopolitical consciousness. And I think Sal knew how to do this without making it about him. He made it about the kids. So I had a wonderful experience, lost my voice that weekend just in everything we were doing. But more importantly, I actually felt whole. Even though this is a sad reality, you might go through college, you might have a wonderful experience, but it may not mean much to you because of how you felt through that entire process. Because perhaps you didn't feel any love while you were doing it. And you were out there fending for yourself and trying to figure out what it meant to be you in a space that, quite frankly, was telling you you don't belong. This country right now is in a space where they're telling a lot of folks very vividly that you're not a part of it, that you're a part of a problem, that you're a part of an infestation to be eradicated and removed. I'm crying because of something else, folks, but it's all sort of tied. So what does it mean in the context of the CCOE? I've been thinking long and hard about it, and I'm like, I'm so proud of working at a school like ours, for a college like ours. I would never trade that, and I think it's because of the work that all you folks do. I think you're preparing the folks that truly love and care about the kids that truly need that love and care. What's that proverb, how's it go? No one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think the way we work with our students, the way we've started to transform ourselves in working with our students, it's emblematic of this legacy that Sal Castro and others have put in front of us, and we're expanding it. We're continuing that work, and I hope especially for the new faculty members, I love it when I meet folks like Miguel who can come in and light a spark. Maria, who told me, hey, I need your help with this. Chuck, who I sat down and I feel like I'm rapping with someone. I mean, it's great to meet folks that are coming in with energy, but energy that's substantiated in true care. And so I hope this wasn't too jumbled, but I think in times of political uncertainty and these tumultuous times, we gotta love. I think we gotta look out for each other. We gotta look out for our students. We don't know what is going on in the back of the minds of a lot of our folks, but let's humanize this learning experience so that they in turn can humanize it for other students in schools and classrooms. So I'll leave you with this. When the middle school was dedicated for Sal, I think that was back in 2009, right? You could tell he didn't want it, and that's so beautiful to see. You could tell he didn't want it. Like, it's not about me. My sister actually was part of the folklorico group that danced for it. And she's like, no lo quiere, you know? And it was just him. And he was doing it. It just reminded you that people do it for the right reasons. You know, I'll just leave you all with this. El sueño se hace a mano y sin permiso. El sueño is a dream, se hace a mano. As you do it by hand, you work hard, y sin permiso, without permission, which also means, and Sal will tell us, without excuses, meaning you gotta work hard for your dreams, and you don't ask anybody for permission, you disrupt. And I think Sal's legacy is one of disruption, but it's disruption coming from a place of love. Thank you all.
Another hand for the panel. I mean, I'm just so grateful to all of you for being here. And very happy that we're videotaping this because I think it sets a really beautiful stage for the work ahead for CCOE and for our university in acknowledging educators, heroes in our community, and role models that we need to continue to follow. I'd like to ask one question to get us started as a follow-up, and then invite you to prepare your questions to ask the panel. But picking up on the last couple of sets of comments around the particular legacy that each one of our panelists takes from Sal Castro's contributions. You mentioned love as one of the key components. I'd like to know from the other panelists, what do you take to heart from Sal Castro's legacy that you think is important to share with the CCOE community of faculty, staff, students, and beyond as well?
I think that my experience with Sal, and I'm going to go on a personal level, is that after you interacted with him, he left you with a feeling, a certain kind of feeling about yourself and about your possibilities. And one of the things I think that's so important for an educator is to never forget that as you interact with your students, there's not only a cognitive aspect to this, but there's this affect that results. And the affect can either be very positive, or sometimes, as was our experience in many of the schools we went to, it was negative. With Sal, when I talked with my sister, she said, you know, when I got out of Campus Kramer, she said the feeling I had was I had hope, and I had this sense of feeling that I could do anything I wanted to do. And I think that's what, for me, with Sal, it was that feeling that he empowered you. And he empowered you not only cognitively, because he gave you the history, but he empowered you so that when you got out of there, you felt that way. You felt like you could make a difference. You felt like you could impact the world. And I think that's a part of education that in many places it's missing. It's not there. And so for us as faculty, I think the other part of the job is that when our students finish at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock, that they leave the classroom feeling a certain way about themselves and about their possibilities.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Anybody else? David?
Yeah, just real quick, I think everybody's on the same boat in terms of the concern for the students. I'm a little bit more concerned being a bureaucrat on this campus, but starting as a extreme activist on the campus, that as Sal lived in a bureaucratic institution, and he was living a contradiction. We're all living a contradiction, those of us who have made it, including yourselves. So the minute we've moved from Bandini, which is now City of Commerce, to the campus, and we get in, we're already distanced from our community. Mentally, politically perhaps, because you want to blend in. I think the legacy he lives for those of us to follow by example is that in spite of the fact that we're going to get support, we've got progressive leadership with the dean, which has been evolving over years. It just didn't happen. She just didn't wake up and get here. It evolved over time. And she has a history of doing that wherever she was at. Having said that, no disrespect to the leadership here or in the tower, we're living a contradiction. So you've got to manage the contradiction if you're faculty members till you get tenure. If you're managers, ooh, we ain't got no protection. We serve at the pleasure of. Some of us were fortunate to be here for 33 years, maybe a little longer, because I was a student here too, one of the first DOP students in 68, 69. To be able to maneuver the contradiction and still end up, I'm nowhere as famous as Sal, but with a name on the building on campus. So my community, when they came to the event, they said, oh, do we have to send an RSVP? I said, yeah, but don't worry about it, man. Just show up, man, bring busloads. So they did. Anyway, the point is that Sal wasn't about him. And I felt probably the same way, because I'm nowhere as near as famous and as committed and as giving as Sal was, to have my name on front of the campus to this day. But the problem is, we got to own it the way we got it, not the way that they think they gave it to us. And that goes for you guys too, is that you got to challenge the contradictions that you're in. And that'll make you a stronger person with the students and with the community and with the thing that we still haven't met yet. It's not over. People think it's over because we have these numbers and stuff like that. We're in a worse opposition now than we were in the 60s and 70s. I don't want to, you can't sugarcoat it for a variety of reasons. People try and make it, well, under Obama we did this and that. If you really study a lot of the contradictions, that's the thing you got to be aware of. I better shut up. Anyway, I'll get mad.
Okay. Anybody else on the panel? Carlos?
I want to start weaving from the threads that David put out there, take them up and remind every single one of us of something he already said, that we are the state. And it's a colonial state. I'm speaking to you as a brown person living under white supremacy, where literally every day I wake up worrying about the two young men that I birthed, that my wife birthed with me. I can't take that credit. And I worry about that every day now, because there is literally a target on brown-skinned, black-skinned people in this country right now. And we are the state, and we occupy extreme positions of power, even if it's only in our classrooms. Every single day that we walk into the charter college, we bring with us the institutional sanctioning of the state. The same state that pays our checks. As David said, we're a living, walking contradiction. It's the same state that's ripping families apart, Holocaust style. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, and I don't have the answer other than for myself. I have no truths to teach, as I tell my students. I just have stories to tell, and then people can decide what they can take from my story to make part of their own and weave it in there. And I ask every one of you to think about every single space you occupy in this college. There's a hell of a lot of power. We grade human beings. We assess. And often we let NCATE and a bunch of other outside forces tell us how to do that. We're a total living, walking contradiction. This university paints itself as the university of social mobility at the same time it declares impaction. So what can you do in every micro instance of the spaces that you are privileged? I'm a tenured professor. There's no more privilege in this society, I think, than that of a tenured professor. How do I turn that against what is being done to our students? Our demographic is the one with a target on its back. The black community will tell you that target's always been on our back. The LGBT community will tell you right now that the state is also attacking them. Women will tell you that their rights are being attacked right now at this very moment. How do we use every single space that we are given power in to shift it? Our assessments, our student learning outcomes, our idea of what is fair. I hear so many of us often say, it wouldn't be fair to other students. You have no idea what other students are living. I don't have any idea, because I now live the contradiction David is talking about, with a pension and vested lifetime health insurance in a society that is still debating whether everybody should have life insurance. So I ask you, that's what I would say. I think Sal would be echoing, I'm ventriloquating perhaps for him right now, echoing what I imagine he would be saying, which is how do we do what he did back then? And I really have to say this right now, Dolores' work was fundamental in making me understand that there is always an erased history and an invisible history of the role women have played in every single movement. And so I want to say that also, that let's not forget who our teaching force is. It's fundamentally a feminized and proletarianized labor force. And we have to make gender and issues of sexuality key to every one of those spaces I ask you all to consider contesting.
Thank you. Any final comments from the panel? If not, we'll entertain questions from the audience. Yes, we'll start right here on this table.
So I grew up on the East Coast, and I had never heard of the East LA 13, the walkouts in 68. I was born in 68, but so this has all been very captivating for me. And one of the things that I think came across very clearly was that Sal empowered individuals as well as societal movement, which I find very heroic as well as fascinating. My question is, and I don't know if anyone has the answer to this, did anyone ever ask him what empowered him?
Inside him, he had a moral compass. He knew what was right. He knew what was wrong. And, okay, this is very little-ish, minor, but he always was working for and rooting for the underdog. He never took a position of power. He was always looking out for the little guy. I said he was a union man. He loved picketing my school. Loved it. My God, how could your faculty be against you when your man is out there picketing with them, okay? So that, but the other thing is that I'll continue with the union. He never met a union line that he would cross, and he would always join it. So he was, I probably, just from having gone back and forth, family separation, the growing up, but the underdog, the person who did not have power, was the person that he was on the side. Sorry, I just had to jump in.
Thank you.
I don't think I'll need the mic. I got a really loud voice.
We need you for the tape.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. This is my 30th year here as a faculty member at the CCOE. This is the most amazing event that I have been to in 30 years. Each one of you, I never got a chance to meet Sal Castro, but each one of you what you had to say, the impact that he had on your life, the way you talked about our obligation to continue to push forward. I cannot thank each and every one of you enough for being here, for sharing with us Sal Castro and his effect on you, and each of your own experiences in taking his message forward. I'm so glad it's being videotaped. This needs to be the stuff of Cal State LA. It needs to continue to be the stuff of Cal State LA. We are at war. We're at war with ignorance, with intolerance, and stupidity. I just cannot thank each and every one of you for what you've given me today, and I really hope we can pay it forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? While you're thinking about how to frame a question, I'd like to come back to one of the comments that was offered by David early on in terms of compromise. And David, you said one of the things to remember is, given your position, don't compromise. Okay? We're taught to learn to compromise, right? To get allies, to get things achieved, to make progress. How do we reconcile that advice with the current reality that you've all just described in our educational systems, for example, where many will say and would say, and the data proves, is that we probably have slipped back in our educational progress. We may have 10 times more black and brown students, or at least brown students in classes, but in terms of achievement, okay, proportionally, those numbers don't hold. Okay. How do we continue to make progress or create a much more deliberate sense of progress without compromise?
It's a difficult task. Like I said, I was a manager for the majority of the time. Well, not really the majority. Well, I don't know how to split it. You got to maneuver that contradiction if you're really committed to doing it. Many times along the way, in my own personal experience, is that when the university became aware of us, they were always aware of us because there were two budgets on campus, statewide, that were protected. Disabled Student Service and EOP, the Educational Opportunity Program. You couldn't transfer money out of those areas without the approval of that director. So you could imagine, at that time, 15, 19 presidents, including our own here, who couldn't live with that. That how could this little chubby fat Mexican control $3.7 million and I can't do nothing about it? So there's these contradictions you got to work with. Along the way, you know, people say, well, you know, how about if you become the czar of the campus for education equity for the whole campus and bring a couple positions with you and you can keep a car and then we'll send you to lobby in Washington and DC and stuff like that. I wasn't a tie and suit kind of guy. So I turned it down. So these things will come along the path. And I think the thing you have to do is you have to make decisions of what you're gonna, the limit you're gonna do. The problem is you can't do it alone. So form groups of like-minded people and other people who have to be educated. I mean, here's a gentleman, it's a great example, and he says this is one of the best things that has happened in the years that he's been here. It shouldn't only be happening in school of education, should be happening in every college and everything, in every department, because we're negligent in all those areas. I was at a panel yesterday, National Latino Media Coalition. They fight the big stations for equity. The thing they had in common between the Cuban American who came here and is now a showrunner, I learned all kinds of new names, a showrunner, a Canadian, and these are people volunteering times to train people how to be screenwriters in the Latino community. From Canada, another gentleman from some Romanian country, and then the last one, a Mexican from Mexico City, who's a showrunner also. The thing they had in common is they were all immigrants. The second thing they had in common, the points that you talk about, is that they were all poor. They're no longer poor. So their commitment is to make as many media people efficient so they could tell their stories in the media. The true stories, not the ones that you see invented, the gangbangers, and they talked about that too. So I think that's one of the things you gotta begin to talk about among yourself is how do you get people together that see the contradictions so you can protect each other? Because you can't. Everybody's gonna have the role. You can't put you can't get so crazy that you say, well, how come we didn't do this? You know, we're gonna take over the campus. Well, that's not gonna happen, you know? Not the way that we used to talk about it back then. I mean, we thought that EOP would be unnecessary in 10 or 15 years. It's needed now more than anything. And it's not needed for only EOP students, it's needed for the whole campus, because the majority of the students that do come in are still underprepared and underserved. And you could do it this way. Native American, look at the statistics on our campus, Native, or any of the campuses in urban area. Native American, then you start with African American male, female, then you go on to the other ones. You can't just limit it to the target area, but you got to look at the other areas as well. There's Chinese American that are poor. There are people in Appalachia that are poor. I didn't start learning this because I wasn't a big intellectual. I started traveling places. And the more I traveled to New York and met people there, and then I went overseas through organizations that sponsored me, Africa or Asia or whatever, then you got to see that they're in the same boat that we are. They're just in a different situation. Anyway, like I said, I'll shut up.
Agustin, you had something to add?
Yeah, no, the thought I was having, I know it's being recorded, so sorry. It's, I guess the best analogy I can come up with, and Dr. Fazzi will probably can attest that this is what I do, is you color within the lines without habitually crossing outside of the line. And then you do sort of introspection and some internal reconnaissance, and you try to improve what we have to offer to optimize for students. That actually doesn't sound that bad, but what I really mean is it's like playing a football game. It's organized chaos. There's a lot going on, and you gotta try to make sense out of it. So I appreciate, especially faculty. I'm looking at Jamie back there, who has like understood what I meant when, like, I gotta get this done for this one student or for this group of students. I think all of you actually contribute to this work very significantly and provide actually integrity to our programs to help students get out. But on Monday, when we were sitting down and you know, our interim provost, Jose Gomez, walked in and said, you know, we're hitting 10% graduation for four-year graduation, right? Like I was disgusted. I wanted to throw up, and I'm like, I'm part of this machine, and we're proud of 10%. I mean, I felt yucky. And I guess the second part to what I'm saying is I like to turn it back to you, Octavio, in your role, which is a very interesting role with its structure and layers and so forth. How do you reconcile what you should do with your title, right? And the work of a campus like ours, predominantly Latinx, with everything that David described. How do we reconcile that, and also impaction? I remember we had a town hall, one of our SAL meetings, where you were speaking, and it's kind of like I know what Octavio wants to say, and I know what Octavio says as the VP, right? And so how do we do all that without, sending the wrong message or doing the wrong thing necessarily or inadvertently?
Yeah, it's obviously, for me, it's not an easy answer either, but I can tell you that my work ethic has always been, we have to do this together. We can't rely on one community to push or pull or drag. This has to be a collective effort. If we really are committed to seeing Cal State LA become that beacon that we know it needs to be in LA for multiple communities, we've got to do it together. College of Ethnic Studies, for example, that's being proposed. I'm already hearing concerns about the college, right, that are rooted in sort of some old conspiracies and histories that have very little to do with the current reality, not just in LA or in California, but around the country. So if I'm not able, with your support and with your participation and with your leadership, to push along the idea that this is overdue on a campus that espouses the values that we do, okay, then I will have failed, and it's time for somebody else to use a different approach. So my short answer is collectively. We do this together. And speaking with each other, being willing to disagree, okay, and realizing that universities are imperfect. Universities will do the right thing today and the wrong thing tomorrow, okay, and not recognize it on the third day. Okay? That's the way universities are created, but it's our responsibility as educators. And this tradition of dividing administrators versus faculty and staff and so forth, I also think we need to break that down. I think, we're all educators. And I realize I'm not naive about the other conditions that exist that create positions for people and create categories of people, okay? But the bottom line is it's in our power to work together, to collaborate as educators, which is what every person on this campus is. And we have a commitment to our student body and to those other students that have yet to arrive at our shores, if you will, okay? So it's not an easy process, but I think many of us, 30 years at one department, one institution, you can't be more committed than that. And I know that this gentleman is not alone, right? Certainly not in this college, but across the campus. So let me take a personal moment also just to touch on these 50th anniversaries that are coming up in the near future. Last year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the walkouts by hosting several thousand students from walkout high schools to walk in to higher education, which was a significant success. It created and nurtured much better relationships with our local school districts. This coming year, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of EOP. And do not forget that in August, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Chicano Moratorium, which is also part of the history of this community. And every one of us has a role to play in not just commemorating these historical events, but in bringing them to fruition, bringing those goals to fruition as a university, not just as a college. And finally, I'll tell you with absolutely no compunction at all, that this college is an incredible model for the rest of the university, not just in the approach you take to education, in the leadership that guides that approach, but in your involvement and leadership across the campus. Leave it to the educators to keep us on track. So I encourage you to continue that tradition. And finally, I just once again want to thank every one of the members of the panel for joining us this morning and sharing your thoughts about Sal Castro. I look forward to the day when we can actually name an entire college after Sal Castro. So thank you once again, and thank you for hosting this event.